When we sat down to plan our preaching series at the start of 2025, I threw out this idea of a series on Elijah, mainly because, as much as anything, he was a bit of a biblical blind spot for me. I don't know what your thoughts on Elijah were before the start of this series, but I kind of had this niggling feeling that I know he's important, but I don't really know why. Obviously, he gets talked about in the New Testament. He appears at the Transfiguration with Jesus, and because he was taken up to heaven, there was this speculation amongst the Jews that he might come back one day, and the New Testament talks of this kind of nuanced fulfillment of Elijah's ministry through John the Baptist, which is a whole other sermon, so don't worry. So I knew he was important, but in terms of the actual story, to my shame, the first thing that probably came to my mind about Elijah before this series was that he asked the prophets of Baal if their God had gone for a wee. I didn't have a right lot else beyond that, so I'm grateful to Paul and Ash and others for teaching us through this series. I now feel like I know Elijah a little bit better and hopefully have some more insightful things to say about him other than his playground insults. So I guess it's with a bit of a tinge of disappointment that we close the book on Elijah today. And we do so with this crazy account of how he's taken up to heaven on chariots of fire and he's spared the bitter taste of death. Now, people will inevitably draw comparisons between this text and Genesis chapter 5, where Enoch's taken up to heaven in a sort of a similar way. And people have drawn all sorts of conclusions about these two and run off with all kinds of theories. But I guess the logical question on everyone's mind after reading what Steve's just read for us is quite clearly, why? Why was Elijah spared death? And I think subliminally we kind of split the why into two, don't we? A, what was so special about Elijah? And B, why not any of the other great Bible characters? You know, Abraham, Moses, David, John the Baptist, the Apostle Paul. You know, Elijah did some mad stuff, don't get me wrong, but would not any of these guys been equally as deserving of a send-off like this? You know, for instance, I mentioned John the Baptist. Now, you can draw plenty of comparisons between John the Baptist and Elijah, but how they both met their end is certainly not one of them. You know, Jesus said that of all the people born of woman, there's arisen no one greater than John the Baptist. And he gets his head lopped off in a prison cell and served as a side dish at one of Herod's banquets. You know, it's hard to think of a more ignominious end for supposedly the greatest man who's ever lived. So why does someone like John cop for it, but Elijah doesn't? Well, to answer this, I did what everyone else seems to be doing nowadays, and I asked ChatGPT, just out of daft curiosity as much as anything else. But rather than giving me like a deep, insightful explanation, which I was kind of hoping for, it gave me an answer that really I should have been able to figure out on my own. First thing it said was, quite correctly, because God wanted to. You know, it was God's sovereign choice to take Elijah in this way. Now, you might think that sounds like a bit of a cop-out. Like I've said, you know, plenty of clever people have come up with theories and reasons, but the fact is, we don't get an explanation in the Bible that wraps everything up for us with a neat little bow. But if we're not careful, we can miss the wood for the trees in this story, I think. Now, feel free to disagree with me on this, but I don't think getting hung up on the question of why was Elijah spared death really matters all that much. I know this is going to sound a bit stupid, but I don't think the story of Elijah being taken up to heaven is really about Elijah, or at least not primarily. What I think is important, and what we're going to look at, is what the events described in this chapter mean for the main character of the story in my eyes, and that's Elisha. See, I can do it. We've started to explore Elisha over the past few weeks, and we began to explore last week the beginning of the process of the transition from Elijah to Elisha as the main prophetic witness in Israel. The passing of the baton, as Ash described it to us. And the symbolism and all the crazy events described in this chapter, I think, are mainly for Elisha's benefit. Ash spoke to us last week, didn't he, if you remember, about his granddad and the preparations that he made to pass on his business after he died. I kind of linked it to the transition between these two, and I certainly don't want to repeat anything that he said, but if you'll allow me to put a slight variation on it, Ash focused on the crossover period where Elisha studied under Elijah for a time. But what we have now is the actual moment itself. The time is upon us, if you like. And I tried to think of it like a similar transition in a modern context. The best one I could come up with was when Sir Alex Ferguson stepped down as Man United manager in 2013. Apologies if you're not into football. History, football and cricket, that's pretty much all I've got as a library of illustrations, so just bear with me. Well, I remember clearly Ferguson stood on the pitch at Old Trafford in pouring rain in front of 80-odd thousand people and gave quite a short speech. I went back and watched it. It's less than 5 minutes long. And at no point during those 5 minutes does he say, hey, I won 13 Premier League titles, I won 2 European Cups, I won goodness knows how many domestic trophies, hooray for me. Not once in this speech does he mention anything he achieved. The only thing that most people can remember about this speech is this famous line that he gave, I want you all to get behind our new manager. A guy called David Moyes took over from him, and if anyone's wondering how he got on, don't look it up, it's not important. What is important is that even after everything he had achieved, Sir Alex was chiefly concerned with the safeguarding of the future of the club and the transition to the new manager. Didn't choose to make his retirement about him. And I think the temptation when reading about the ascension of Elijah is that this is some kind of cosmic celebration of everything he's achieved as a prophet. This is one huge divine pat on the back that he's getting, if you like. I'm sure there's an element of that. But if you stop there, I think you're kind of missing the point. This is about the transition. I think this is kind of like God saying, if you'll pardon the slightly dodgy illustration, I want you all to get behind the new gaffer, the new chief prophet. So as we go on to explore this a little bit more, I'd like to ask a question which I want to use to kind of underpin the rest of this talk. Reading between the lines of what Steve read for us, I think this is a question that's eating away at Elisha. And it's also a question that can eat away at many of us. It's a question that mankind has debilitated over for many, many years, and when answered the wrong way, it's led to all sorts of problems in society, in the church, and plenty of other places. The question is quite simply, how can I know that God is with me? How can I know God is with me? Honestly, I think reading through this text, this question is burning a hole through Elisha. He knows Elijah's going, so is God going to be with him in the same way that he was with Elijah? And I've just got two sort of main anchor points, if you like, as we go forward. My first one is, Elisha's fear is a question of misplaced trust. Elisha's fear is a question of misplaced trust. And secondly, what we'll go on to look at is what methods does God use to focus Elisha's trust in the right place. So let's just take the first one of those then. What clues do we get from the text for where Elisha is putting his trust? The first thing we notice straight away is that Elijah being called home to heaven is no secret and no surprise to anyone. Everywhere Elijah and Elisha go on their little journey, the company of prophets seem intent on rubbing it in Elisha's face. Everyone and their mothers seems to know what's going on. It probably made the front page of the Lower Jordan Valley Gazette. Elisha tells 3 different groups of prophets quite emphatically to stop going on about it. End of verse 3. I think we can detect a note of frustration in Elisha's voice, to say the least. We all hate things being pointed out to us that we already know. Is there an undertone of kind of worry in Elisha's voice, perhaps? Secondly, Elisha sticks to Elijah like a limpet through these first few verses. They go from Bethel to Jericho to the banks of the Jordan. And each time Elijah tries to send Elisha away, but he won't have it. We're not totally sure why this was. We'll explore that question a little bit more later on. But either way, we definitely get the vibe that Elisha is not ready to say goodbye. And there's a kind of anxious attachment in him, if you like. Then we get the request in verse 9 for Elisha to inherit a double portion of Elijah's spirit. Now, in Jewish terms, this was Elisha saying, I want to be your heir. I want to be like you. I want to inherit what you've got. But I'm not totally sure I can do it, so you better give me 2 helpings just to be sure. Now, is he feeling inadequate when faced with the weight of responsibility that's coming his way? And then when Elijah's finally taken away in verse 12, he tears his garment, classic Old Testament show of grief and anguish. He refers to Elijah twice as my father, which gives a pretty clear indication of the kind of relationship that they had. And finally we get to the apex of this text. Once the dust settles in verse 14, there's a pregnant pause as Elisha picks up the cloak that Elijah left behind and asks the heartbreaking question, where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah? Such an emotional weight behind this question. Don't let it get lost on you. The anguish, the uncertainty, the grief is coursing through the veins of Elisha at this point. This is not so much a question as a cry from the heart. But was Yahweh the God of Elijah only? Did Elisha see Elijah as some kind of conduit between God and the rest of the prophets and him maybe? Is it possible that Elisha's put Elijah on so much of a pedestal that now he's gone, he thinks the presence and power of God has gone with him? Is there a danger that we can esteem an individual so much that we can actually bind our faith to them in a way that can actually be harmful in the long run? And we see this happen today, don't we? A modern example could be like a pastor or a spiritual leader who gets caught up in some kind of scandal or public disgrace. And what often happens as a result? People walk away from the faith. People's faith becomes damaged, because to bind your faith too tightly to a person is always going to be a risk. Ultimately, you're placing your faith in something that might fail you. Jeremiah 17 verse 5 says, "Cursed is the one who trusts in man, who draws strength from mere flesh, if it causes your heart to turn away from the Lord." Now, I'm certainly not saying that Elijah's failed anyone, and I'm not saying that Elisha's turned away from the Lord by any means. But I think it's probably fair to say at this point that Elisha can't really see how his relationship with God will function without Elijah. Elisha wanted that double portion of Elijah's spirit as if it was his to give. And the only way Elisha will ever live up to Elijah is by the grace of God alone. Building up a spiritual mentor or leader as irreplaceable will ultimately distract us from God's goodness. Most of you will know, some of you won't. Paul Howell, who often preaches for us, was the first pastor, the founding pastor, if you like, of Christchurch. I've spoken to him, by the way. He knows I'm going to say this, so nobody panic. But Paul, by traditional church standards, particularly evangelical church standards, didn't do the job for all that long. Don't shoot me. It might have felt like a lifetime to you. I'm not trying to sell you short. I'm not totally sure how long it was, but it certainly wasn't the 30, 40, 50 years that I've known some pastors lead churches for. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that in and of itself, but I know part of Paul's motivation for moving on when he did was to not risk being that irreplaceable figurehead, and not wanting the identity and future of this church to become too synonymous with him as an individual. Ultimately, the successful ministry of this church didn't depend on Paul when he started it, although we're very grateful for his time. It doesn't now depend on Ash as his successor. Whoever takes over from Ash somewhere down the line, it won't depend on them either. I mean this with all due respect, mate. I love you dearly. But don't hang your hat on Ash Gibson as your only spiritual authority. Or anyone else for that matter. Not any of the leaders here Not mega church pastors on the telly, not Tim Keller, not Spurgeon, not Calvin, not the Pope, or anyone else. Obviously, we respect and value the ministry of pastors and writers and church leaders massively, of course we do. But none of them are infallible. And crucially, to bring us back to 2 Kings chapter 2, none of them are irreplaceable. No matter how influential, no matter how charismatic, no matter how eloquent, no matter how dedicated, if the Lord does not build the house, all our charisma and insight and strategies mean nothing. We labor in vain. Our best deeds are as filthy rags, the Bible tells us. Meaningless unless the blood of Jesus washes them clean and gives them significance. This is what Elisha had to learn. And so laser focused on Elijah that he was risking putting his trust in the wrong place. But in fairness to him, Elisha had a better excuse than most of us for putting Elijah on a pedestal. No church leader that you've ever heard of has called down a single ember from heaven. Elijah stood up to kings and false prophets. He went against the grain. He blazed the trail that must have looked impossible to follow. But the principle remains, he did none of it in his own strength. And Elisha had to embed this into his thinking. So let's move on then. Second anchor point. How is God going to help him do that? How is God going to reorientate Elisha's trust into the right place? And I've split this second little section into 3 subheadings. So we've got the journeys, the ascension, and the cloak. The journeys, the ascension, and the cloak. So we'll look at the journeys first. So Elijah and Elisha travel from Gilgal to Bethel to Jericho and on to the banks of the Jordan. A fair old distance is probably worth pointing out. Around about 20-25 miles on foot. And we don't know for definite why they went to these 3 locations. I'm speculating a bit here, but there must have been a reason. The Lord has sent me is all Elijah tells us explicitly. And we know that at least on the surface, Elijah didn't want Elisha to go with him. Again, we don't know why, 100%. Most of the commentators agree that Elijah is testing Elisha's commitment. Perhaps there's something in these locations that he actually wants him to see. So on the eve of Elijah's departure, as it were, what are they going to see? Well, firstly, they go to Bethel. I don't know if Bethel rings any bells for anybody biblically. Genesis 35 is where I think of. Jacob builds an altar to the Lord. Why did he build it? Because God answered him in the day of his distress and was with him wherever he went. Then they go to Jericho. What are they going to see in Jericho? Well, it would have been pretty impossible for them to miss the rubble and the ruin of the ancient city. A reminder of the great victory won by God's people led by Joshua. Is it a coincidence that they visit the site of the greatest accomplishment of another great successor in Joshua? Perhaps it was a coincidence. Or maybe, whilst walking along this long journey with Elisha deep in thought and worry, Elijah might have said to him something along the lines of, you think you're worried that I'm going to be taken from you. How on earth do you think Joshua felt? No, he had to take over from Moses, the giver of the law, the great patriarch, and he had to lead the people in conquest to a completely unknown land. But he did it in God's strength. And the words of Jacob at Bethel are along the same lines as the words of comfort that Moses gives to Joshua before he takes over. The Lord goes with you. He will never leave nor forsake you. He says it twice in Deuteronomy 31. Is there a pattern of remembrance here intended to bring comfort to Elisha? Ultimately, we don't know. This is pure speculation, but the majority of the commentators kind of agree that this is something of a farewell tour around some significant locations in Israel's history. Obviously, Elisha's probably trying to see as many of the company of prophets as he can before he goes, but it would have been impossible for the significance of these places to be lost on Elisha. Remembering their history is something the Old Testament believers were very good at and very meticulous about. Altars, Ebenezer stones, psalms reminding the people of the past and all the ways that God had led them. This was a staple of their faith. Looking to the past can give comfort in our present circumstances, can it not? We're perhaps not as good at this type of thing as contemporary believers. I think the principle still stands. We can look at how God has led us in the past, either personally or as a universal church, and we can draw comfort from it. Boydie sent quite an interesting but also quite a worrying article to the elders group chat this week about persecuted Christians in China. There's something of a crackdown going on. It seems pastors are being arrested, churches are being heavily scrutinised, driven further underground. And a guy called Sean Long was being interviewed for this article, and he ended it with this emphatic statement. Persecution cannot destroy the church, because if you look back to history, where there is repression, there is revival. 40-odd million Christians in China, they reckon. That's a conservative estimate. In a country where, logically, Christianity should not thrive. Sean Long very clearly highlights this point we're making. Don't need to panic, because in the face of difficulty, God has grown his church over history, time after time after time after time. Maybe Elisha found some comfort in considering how God had led his people in the past. Next one, the ascension. Elijah is carried up to heaven in verses 11 and 12. Mid-conversation is worth noting, which must have come as quite a shock. And he's carried up in this melee of fire and wind. Now, for those of us that have been here for the other talks of this series, if you haven't been, you can find them online, as Ash mentioned. But you will know that fire and wind are key elements in the story. They are key in demonstrating God's hand. And a cynic might say that the use of fire and wind in the account of Elijah isn't always applied very consistently. So you go back to 1 Kings 19, God clearly says to Elijah, I'm not in the fire and wind. Fast forward to 2 Kings 2, we're back to using fire and wind. So that's nice and confusing. But I think it's worth highlighting that in 1 Kings 19, we get a very intimate picture of Elijah and God. If you remember, Steve Watson spoke to us on this a few weeks ago. It's just the two of them sharing this beautiful moment. But in most other instances of the story of Elijah, the outlandish miracles, the signs are usually done for someone else's benefit or as like a public declaration. Not all of them. There's the Raven story, for instance. But in most of them. And the parting miracle that Elijah is involved in, again, serves a purpose to benefit somebody else. Now, I said, let's not get too hung up on why Elijah was chosen to be taken off to heaven, but the immediate reason in the text is quite obvious, isn't it? Elijah says to Elisha, I'm going to be taken up, and if you look at me, if you behold the magnitude of what's happening, you will get what you've asked for. Your fears will be dealt with. The key for Elisha is to look. Verse 10, if you see me, it will be yours. This is a bit of a contrived application, granted, but do we look at God? Now, obviously, we're not going to see him in the same way that Elisha did, but do we look? And I'm not talking about a passing glance either. I'm talking about the beholding that the Old Testament talks about. The Hebrew word hina means to give your full attention to or to completely focus on. And when we fear we're alone, when worry overtakes us, where do we look? Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Do we know the truth of these words? Or does our faith wither and doubt increase because we don't expose it to the sunlight. We might give God a passing glance in times of uncertainty, but do we truly behold him? Probably won't see a flaming chariot or a whirlwind. We might see God's glory revealed in his word, or in his creation, or in the love and care of brothers and sisters. God may also send the miraculous as well. I certainly don't want to rule that out. 2 Corinthians 3 verse 18 says, "We all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory." To fully contemplate God is transformative. By Elisha beholding the miracle of God, taking Elijah in some inexplicable way, he gets that double portion of his spirit. He gets the reassurance that he's after. Thirdly and finally, the cloak. So Elijah has now gone and left behind nothing but his cloak. Verse 13, Elisha then picked up Elijah's cloak that had fallen from him and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. Took the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and struck the water with it. "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he asked. When he struck the water, it divided to the right and to the left, and he crossed over. So again, Ash has already spoken to us last week about the significance of the cloak. This was likely Elijah's only cloak, stained with blood and muck and all the hallmarks of a tough life. Elijah parts the waters with it in verse 8. And then in the ultimate act of comfort and blessing in this story, God allows Elisha to perform the same miracle without the need for Elijah's physical presence. Can you imagine the relief that must have washed over him? All his fears and his nervous anxiety leading up to this moment. Are you with me, God? How do I know if you're there? We're all put to bed in this moment. And if you're ever tempted to doubt, like Elisha did, that you are capable of doing anything for God's glory, meditate on the fact that a simple, dirty, weather-worn piece of cloth can be used by God to do something miraculous. I can only speak as someone who occasionally sticks his neck out to speak at the front, but I find this very liberating. I'm not irreplaceable by any means. I haven't had loads of training. I don't know Greek. I've got an awful lot going for me. But if God can use a cloak, he can use me. He can use Elisha, who was filled with fear and anxiety. He can use me, and he can use you. Maybe you've had conversations with your friends or your colleagues, and you might feel like, as I certainly have on so many occasions I can't even count, like you're bumbling your way through trying to explain it, and getting it wrong or sounding silly. God can use you however you feel, or whoever you are. So take heart. Not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, declares the Lord Almighty, in Zechariah chapter 4. The waters parted not because Elisha or Elijah carried any special power, but because God wanted to give the encouragement of his presence. I couldn't do a whole talk on the Old Testament without going to Dale Ralph Davis on this. And there's a quote from his commentary, and all it says is one short little sentence. Elijah was gone, but Yahweh remained. Elijah was gone, but Yahweh remained. If you want a single sentence to sum up 2 Kings chapter 2, you won't get much better than that. So just as we close, let me just summarize quickly. Elisha feared that with Elijah leaving, God would go with him. Placed too much of his trust in the person of Elijah. And we have to be careful that we're not tempted to place too much of our trust somewhere where it doesn't belong. God gave him comfort through the places they visited and a reminder of Israel's past. Through Elijah's ascension, God caused him to look and behold his glory. And through the cloak, Through the simplest of items, God declared, I am with you, Elisha. You might be here today asking the same question that we asked at the start. Are you with me, God? The cry of Elisha might be your cry. Where now is the Lord? And if it is, then you have to understand that this is not a question we were ever designed to have to ask. Now, if you jump right back to the beginning in Genesis 3, after the fall of Adam and Eve, the shoe's on the other foot. God is calling to us. Genesis 3 verse 9, the Lord called to the man, where are you? And back comes the reply, I was afraid, so I hid. The sin and shame of Adam drove him from God's presence. Through the fallen nature that we inherited from him, we've been paying for it ever since. Here now in the 21st century, we still cry out, don't we? In confusion, in fear, in anguish sometimes. Where now is the Lord? And then if you flip all the way forward to the end of time, what's a key element of the judgment that God declares on the unbelieving? Is it not an eternity spent asking this question, where now is the Lord? Separation at the beginning, there's potential separation at the end, but for one reason. The one we call Emmanuel. How can we have hope that God is with us? What more emphatic statement of hope do we need than Jesus, who answered this question with his very name? Emmanuel, God with us. This was how Jesus announced himself to the world as he was born into his earthly life. How does Matthew end his account of Jesus' earthly life in his gospel? I am with you always to the end of the age. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ ensures that we never have to ask that question again. Where now is the Lord? He is with us. He dwelt amongst us as a man. His Spirit dwells amongst us still. He will never leave nor forsake us. And the story of Elijah points us to him. Elijah might have avoided death, but Jesus defeated it. Because of his death and resurrection, we are not alone.